Inside Edward Zakrzewski's final day, Florida veteran's final defiance. Hello, friends. Today we step into the chilling final hours of a man once trusted to protect and serve. Edward Zakrzewski was a decorated U.S. Air Force sergeant, a husband, and a father. But in June 1994, that quiet suburban life shattered when he turned his own home into a crime scene that stunned Florida and the entire country. Nearly 3 decades later, the state carried out its verdict, ending the life of a man who never showed the remorse many expected. On July 31, 2025, Edward's story closed with a sharp, sarcastic farewell and a timeline that felt as cold as the crime itself. In this video, we'll retrace those final 24 hours, from his last meal to his final words, and the moments that sealed his fate. Stay with me to the end, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you won't miss more true crime stories told with clarity and detail. Dear friends, this is the story of a man who once wore the uniform of trust, then tore it apart with his own hands. The case of Edward Zakrzewski is not just about a crime, it's about a decorated U.S. Air Force sergeant who became the architect of his family's destruction, and the long, silent years that followed before the state finally ended his life. On July 31, 2025, the Florida State Prison in Rayford woke early. For most inside, it was just another summer day. But for Edward, it was the last. Guards moved with quiet precision. The 60-year-old inmate, gray-haired and heavier than the young man arrested decades earlier, was already awake by 5 o'clock in the morning. He had been told the day before no more stays, no more appeals. This was it. He declined a chaplain. He turned away a Bible. He didn't request to see anyone. Instead, he followed the routine with the calmness of someone who had stopped fighting years ago. At breakfast, he barely ate. By noon, he requested his final meal: fried pork chops, potatoes, bacon, onions, toast, root beer, a slice of pie, ice cream, and coffee. He ate slowly, as if savoring something ordinary for the last time. The hours between lunch and evening were quiet. Officials prepared the chamber, checked the straps, tested the IV lines. Inmates nearby stayed hushed. Executions leave a shadow that everyone can feel. At 5:30 in the evening, the small group of witnesses was escorted to the viewing area. There were reporters, prison staff, and state officials. No family members were present. The people who had once called him husband and father were long gone, their absence louder than any words. At 6 o'clock in the evening, guards opened the heavy steel door. Edward entered, shackled but steady. He wore the same tan uniform every Florida inmate wears, but he carried himself like a man in control of his final act. Strapped to the gurney, leather restraints tightened across his chest and legs. He faced the glass without flinching. When the warden asked if he had any last words, Edward gave something no one expected: sarcasm. "I want to thank the good people of the Sunshine State for killing me in the most cold and calculated, clean, humane, and efficient way possible," he said, his voice even. Then, as if reading a script only he understood, he began reciting Robert Frost's "Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening." The words hung heavy. "The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep." He never finished. The drugs were already flowing. At 6:13 in the evening, Edward Zakrzewski was pronounced dead. A man who had spent nearly 3 decades locked in a 6x9 cell was gone in minutes. But behind that calm sarcasm was a story soaked in violence and fear. June 9, 1994, Okaloosa County, Florida. The Zakrzewski home looked like any other in the quiet neighborhood near Eglin Air Force Base. Inside lived Edward, his wife Sylvia, their 7-year-old son Kim, and their 5-year-old daughter Anna. Edward was seen as steady, disciplined, a model technical sergeant, but those close to him knew another side: controlling, jealous, and angry. And neighbors heard whispers if Sylvia ever left, he'd kill her. She had threatened to divorce him before. That morning, the final call came. Young Kim called his dad at work and innocently said, Mom's leaving. Edward didn't shout. He didn't cry. He left base, bought a machete and a crowbar, then returned to finish his shift. When the family came home that evening, the trap was already set. Sylvia walked into the bedroom. Edward attacked with the crowbar, striking her twice. She fell, stunned but alive. He dragged her to the floor and strangled her with a rope. Then, calm as ever, he called for his children. Kim came first, small, trusting. Edward struck with the machete. Kim fought wounds on his hands, showed he tried to defend himself, but the blows were too much. Anna came next, running toward the father she still believed in. She too was struck down. The medical examiner would later say she saw enough to know what was happening. Edward arranged their bodies side by side in the bathroom. Then he left. After the murders, Edward didn't look like a man on the run. He cleaned up, packed, and disappeared. He flew to Hawaii using a false name and joined a small religious commune. For 4 months, he lived quietly, building shacks, attending services, and hiding in plain sight. But the country was looking for him. When Unsolved Mysteries aired his face, it took only hours. Someone at the commune saw the broadcast and said, "That looks like Brother Michael." Edward didn't argue. Days later, he walked into a police station and surrendered. In court, Edward didn't fight the charges. He confessed. There was no question of guilt. Only punishment remained. Prosecutors painted a brutal picture of premeditation. They spoke of Sylvia's fear, of Kim's trust, of Anna's small hands trying to block the blade. The jury voted for death, though not unanimously. Some wanted life, citing his military record and possible stress. But the judge overruled them. He said Anna's fear sealed the sentence. Edward was given 3 death sentences. For 29 years, Edward lived in silence behind concrete walls. He read, filed motions, and waited. Appeals came and went. Lawyers argued Florida's new requirement for unanimous juries could have spared him. The court said no. The aftermath. Edward never became the model prisoner. He rarely showed remorse. Those who visited said he was distant, detached, sometimes bitter. In his final clemency hearing, he spoke quietly, saying, "There's not a night that goes by I don't think about that person. I'm sorry for what happened, but the board denied mercy." On July 31st, 2025, Florida ended the story. 3 lives had been taken in a moment of rage. And now, after decades, the state took one more. When the gurney went still and the clock marked 6:13 in the evening, Edward Zakrzewski's story finally ended. 3 decades of appeals, legal fights, and solitary hours collapsed into a few minutes of silence. For some, it was justice finally done. For others, it was too little, too late. Behind every case like this are names often forgotten. Sylvia, Kim, and Anna, 3 lives that should have been safe in their own home. What makes this case so haunting is not just the crime, but the calmness of a man who carried that weight for 29 years, then faced death with a smirk and a poem. Friends, as we close this chapter, remember that behind every headline is a family forever changed. If you found this story thought-provoking, please subscribe, share, and join us for more prison documentary stories where we uncover the final hours, the broken paths, and the lessons they leave behind.